Well, good morning, Mike, and good morning to all of you listeners out there. This is Steve Larson at Hoard's Dairyman, and we welcome you to our fourth webinar now, and the second one featuring Mike Hutchins as the presenter, and he's going to be talking today on fine-tuning your feeding strategy, and we extend our thanks to Elanco for bringing this webinar to you today. So with that, Mike, we'll let you go ahead.
Well, very good, Steve. Thanks for that kind introduction, and I too want to add our thanks to both Hoard's Dairyman and Elanco for sponsoring this webinar and this series of webinars that will be coming on. Our topic today is fine-tuning your feeding strategy, and I think this slide kind of captures it. Our dairymen are right now have one of the highest milk prices we've had here coming in March of 2011. It's almost as good as me printing money. As you can see, this is one way to make money, and that is to print it yourself. I'm not sure how many banks or food stores or hardware stores would take this, but certainly the emphasis on profit potential, and since our largest input cost is feed costs, that's the focus of today's webinar. Let's kind of set the stage. These numbers are tough to keep up with. These are some feed prices that come out weekly. You can see I'm a week or so behind, but you can, if you think 650, and I guess right now, Steve, we're looking at more than almost 740 now, with a big jump when we discovered we have less corn than we thought we had a week or two ago. But you can see already, even with these modest prices in Wisconsin, Minnesota, which are no longer that low, could be worse. And so, they smile. Things could be worse. And if you're in Okeechobee, Florida, yeah, you're at $8 corn. So obviously, right. These people.
Mike, we just saw $7.80 passed on the corn futures this morning on the CBOT. So these are going to move higher as time goes on here.
Exactly right. And then, as we go along, these were milk prices, and of course I left the March one up there just primarily because that's kind of where, and remember, this is class 3 milk, so obviously you folks in Florida put some real significant dollars on that. But Steve, in Illinois, we put another $1.50, $2 on that as well, so we're going to see $21 Holstein milk. In fact, the U of I this month is getting $21 for their milk, and we got Jersey people smiling at $25 or $26 milk with their fine components and quality premiums. The sobering point, though, as you can see, if you look at the futures, that we're going to come down off that maybe a couple dollars, and so that's going to squeeze us a little bit more as we see these corn prices as well. Any idea where Hoard's is on their milk prices with your Guernseys and Jerseys there, Steve?
Well, we're going to be up in the $25, $26 category here when we get our check for March milk.
Yeah, so obviously in interesting times. Then this came out on the April 4th, kind of what's going to happen with this cropping enterprise. And these were suggested numbers. Corn acreage up 5%, soybeans down 1%, cotton up 15%, and hay down 1%. So it looks like hay is going, and soybeans are going to take a little bit of a hit at this stage of the game as far as acreages go. What that does for fuzzy cottonseed, no one really knows, but our listeners, what are you doing out there? The U of I has locked in gin run for next fall delivery, and we thought the price was favorable, and we could be wrong, but we've locked in 3 semi-loads according to our herdsman, and I thought he did a good job at this stage of the game. And of course, corn acreage is there, so a very fluid situation. As we mentioned earlier, there is corn in the ground in Illinois. We're over 50 degrees here. We picked up some 80-degree temperatures the last several days and an inch of rain. So the question is, well, these temperatures are down 20 degrees now, but we're still going to be in the 60s, which may mean that once it dries out here, according to some people, later this week they're going to be back in the fields putting more corn in the ground. So let's kind of set the stage. I think every dairy farmer, every consultant, every educator looks at what I call a rule. I call this the Hutchins 50-35-15 rule. And what it says, on most dairy farms, at least 50% of the ration dry matter is going to be forage dry matter. Another 35% I think is sort of locked in. This is going to be what I call concentrates. This is going to include your cereal grains. It could include your barley and your corn, your snaplages, your protein sources, your soybean meals, your heat-treated soys, your distiller's grains, your minerals and vitamins and additives. And so I'm saying that's about 85. And then we come down to the last bullet item, and that's what I call the swing 15. So it says, what is that going to be in 2011 on your farm or in your region? We think a lot of it in the Midwest is going to be forages, especially if we can get in our fields, and our alfalfa looks really good. It looks like, at least here in Champaign-Urbana, come through the winter very, very well with very little winter kill. at this point. That could be more forage, especially if it's high quality forage. Now, last year we had a problem. It rained the week we were supposed to be cutting forages. And so we end up getting a much lower quality forage, which then means you could be having more concentrate. Or for some of you online, you say, well, we'll be looking at these byproduct feeds. It could be a citrus pulp in Florida. It could be beet pulp in North Dakota. It could be corn gluten feed here in Illinois. It could be, byproducts from Florida, some of the cannery byproducts. And so the question is, what will that 15% be? And I think that's kind of the focus of today's webinar, and that is say, well, what are some of the factors that are going to drive that? So everybody, and if you don't like, remember this, it says Hutchins up there. So it could be Steve Larson's name up there, and he'd say, well, Hutchins, I think that should be 60 forages and 25 concentrate, and you can work these numbers back and forth. But the question is, what are you going to plant and where are we going to go? And we got some interesting production costs from Dave Fisher we're going to mention here as well. So let's get going. Every time we see a Jersey cow, that means we're going to change topics here on today's webinar, and we should be done about 10 to 1. Hopefully most of you can stay with us as we go through that. So let's talk a little bit about fine-tuning forages, and I think this is a slide that comes from Larry Chase at Cornell that says, in fact, he will be at our 4-State Nutrition Conference here in June talking on this topic. But are we going to be seeing more routine 70% forage diets? I think the answer is yes. And here are all the lists that you can run through. The one that catches my eye is the last one. I think as we start seeing $7.80 bushel corn, I'm not sure our dairy cows can compete with Kellogg's, Corn Flakes, and ADM's ethanol at this stage of the game. I think we're going to go off the human plate. And that's the good news about dairy cattle is you and I can build a ration that you and I as humans can't eat, looking at grasses, looking at byproduct feeds, and products like that. Our dairymen like that fourth one down, and that says healthy rumen environment. As we tend to build into higher forage diets, we tend to have a more favorable rumen environment. And healthy cows tend to stay in herds longer. We see less culling, and we see less rumen dysfunction going on. So certainly I think that's going to come a factor here as we move in. So let's look at the value of corn silage. We had a great question at a conference last year and said, Mike, we're not looking at $40 a ton corn silage anymore. We could be looking at, as you can see here, $60 a ton corn silage. This is one way to back into corn silage prices. May be valuable to think this through. Here you see that number 8. That is a central northern Illinois number. I think that applies, Steve, for you folks in Wisconsin and folks that are online from Iowa and Ohio. And if you get far enough north in Wisconsin or New York, that number becomes 7. This is the relationship of 200 bushel corn silage containing 25 tons of wet silage. And so you can see that's where the number 8 comes from. So if you normally raise 150 bushel corn or 140 bushel corn and you get 20 tons to the acre, and there comes 7. So we back into this price. So there sits 8 times $6 a bushel. And Steve already has indicated that number is wrong. That could be over $7. So what we used it simply here at this $6, and then I add $5. That is the cost of chopping, harvesting, transporting, blowing, covering, packing. That range can go all the way from $4 to $8 a ton, but that's the cost of taking it from the field. So at that $48 a ton, that's mean it's still standing in the field. Either we're going to come in there with a combine and take it as corn in several weeks, or we're going to take it as corn silage sometime here in late August, September, depending where you live. The dollar is for an inoculant, and again, that number can be as low as 80 cents or 60 cents, can be as high as $3 a ton, depending on whose inoculant you're using. And then that 270, you'll see the next line, that's shrink. It simply says I'm going to anticipate losing 5% of the dry matter due to surface losses, fermentation losses, invisible losses. By the way, that 5% number is pretty low. If you look at Brian Holmes' number at Wisconsin Ag Engineering Group, that number is actually closer to 10%, but it simply says that it's sitting in my bunker, in my silo, in my bag, about $57 a ton, and as Steve points out, that could be too low. Another thumb rule is 10 times the price of a bushel of corn. So if corn is $7 a bushel, and the math is simple. I like to back into it because farmers charge and have different costs associated as we had listed up there above. Dave Fisher did some production costs, and depending on where you think the price of corn is going to be, if you think you can raise that, by the way, if you can raise corn for about $3.60 a bushel, then your cost is about $31 a ton. That's the production cost. Now, I'm not going to sell that to you at Hoard's Dairyman because I'm going to have all these other prices on top of that. And if corn is $4.60 a bushel to raise it, and of course we're seeing cash rent at $300 an acre. So then you still got seed corn and production costs and all these other things come into play with that. But I think we're no longer looking at the traditional $40 a ton value in the bag in the silo. And the question is, farmers, where do you want to be? Consultants, where should you be recommending your farmers where corn size should be?
Mike?
Our answer is raise it and raise a lot of it. More about that a bit later.
Mike, just an aside, the new National Milk Producers Federation proposals involve income over feed cost, and they'll be using a corn silage value along with corn grain and alfalfa in their formulas, and their formula will have 10.1 times the futures corn price in setting the value of corn silage. So they're right in that same category.
Yeah, now that number, yes, exactly right, exactly right. Now, another way to look at that is, what about these legumes and grasses that a lot of us love, and because of growing conditions, soil conditions, hills and valleys and stuff like that, historically we've been using a value of $1.1 per point a relative feed value for hay equivalent. So that's another question. So if I take what I like for my cows, a 170 RFQ value times $1.10, and a dollar sign isn't there, but that's where it comes from, it says that would be worth about $187 per ton on a hay equivalent base. Then you can actually calculate that on a cost per pound of dry matter, and you can then value your baleage, your haylage accordingly. Dave Fisher again looked at a cost number, and his number was right $107 per ton. I looked it up this morning, and that was a 5.5 tons per acre, a 4-year stand, and that included one of those 4 years as establishment cost using this spring's fuel. And of course, fuel costs when Dave did this back in March obviously were lower than they are today. So again, the question is, farmers can produce it for $110 a ton. It's worth $187 on the marketplace. And again, now as farmers, as managers, you have to say, where's the balance? Where's the balance on these two feeds? Our guideline in Illinois is 2/3 corn silage and 1/3 legume grass other. That could be baleage, that could be pasture, that could be baled hay, that could be haylage coming out of a bag, bunker, or silo. So again, Steve, I think that's an important question in terms of these values of what it costs to produce. Obviously, have jumped way up because of these input costs. And then, of course, what is the market value of those feeds for animals when we look at producing milk? So we look at forage quality indices. These are my two. We could make this much more expansive, but I think all our listeners, I would challenge, say, when you say quality indices, I want my legume grass at 170 RFQ with an NDF digestibility of 50. Now, that's kind of a high bar for my listeners, kind of a high bar at this point, but that's a 30-hour NDF digestibility, so I think that's a power number. I look at my corn silages here in Illinois, and I'll be well aware these are Illinois numbers, so those of you that are living in different countries and different states, I want my corn silage at least 30% starch and an NDFD digestibility of 55%. That's a 30-hour. Steve and I were briefly talking about BMR corn silage. That NDF digestibility can be a 65 plus. So there's no question that BMR, the low lignin corn silage, will have higher digestibilities. The question you have to ask is what type of starch and what kind of yield performance will you be getting? The next thing on the forage is to be sure that we're processing it properly. These are our guidelines in terms of where we would be on haylage, on corn silage, and that's corn silage at 3/4 inch theoretical length of chop, and that is kernel processed, of course. And of course, we're arguing on the kernel processing. I don't want to see any kernels, because if the corn silage gets a bit on the dry side because of harvesting conditions or a sand knoll or an area in the field, I don't need to see the kernel the second time in the manure coming through the dairy cow. So these would be our guidelines to say, are we processing our silages correctly to end up with a TMR that looks like on top? The new excitement, I think, Steve, sits in the second box. I think that's where you want to be. The second box is not sortable. It basically will contribute to the forage mat. And in fact, if I add the top two boxes together, that is the effective that's the effective fiber I have, or effective particle size I have in the ration. And more about that a bit later. So again, as we get coming into our spring harvest window, which we hopefully will be cutting our first crop haylage in southern Illinois sometime here in early May, then we're not that far away in terms of getting these numbers right as well. Here are the guidelines that we have for our PE, stands for physically effective NDF, and notice the word Hutchins in there because these are my numbers. Everybody calculates them differently. You can see my hay numbers pretty much are straightforward. Grass will be on the high end, 95, alfalfa on the lower end just because of leaf shatter. And then you can see my next three silages. That is the top 2 boxes of the Penn State box. So that's a number that you and I can pretty easily garner using the Penn State box that you can buy at NASCO, and I think is a very good physical form evaluation. The next numbers I borrowed from actually Charlie Sniffen, so you'll recognize that number, and that is simply discounts based on the type of feed it is and its particle size. So Fuzzy Cotton Seeds fiber has 75% the value of hay, which is valued at 95%. You can see beet pulp is about 35%, but if you pellet that, then I lose the shreds, and no, physically I've changed the characteristic of it. You can see soy hulls and most of my ground and pelleted feeds are basically very, very low. So these are PE values. And then what I do is I take and calculate this, and actually I can make Spartan, for example, Spartan 3 actually do this for me. I put in the pounds of dry matter for each feed. So let's pick on corn silage. So I'm feeding, let's say, 20 pounds of corn silage dry matter. I have it tested for NDF, and let's say it's 40% NDF. So I have 40 pounds times 40%. I have 16 pounds of NDF, and I put it through the Penn State box, and it's the top 2 boxes add up to 65%. Then 2/3 of that 16 pounds, or roughly about 11 pounds, is PE NDF, and I can then add to that my hays, my corn, my soy hulls, all my feeds, and I want to have a number somewhere around 19 to 21% PE NDF / Hutchins. I put that up there because Dave Mertens, who is retired now, was at the Forage lab. He calculates it a little differently, and so do some feed companies. But I think it gives us an idea of how well these numbers add together and come together. And so as we wind up here, we're trying to get an idea on this forage fine-tuning in our webinar today, and that is, what is the Penn State box telling us? Number 2, can we make forages too good? And Steve, I smile because I go up to Expo every year and always walk over to the forage area over there and see these 260, 280 relative feed value alfalfa hays and say, you know, I think I could eat that myself. I think my digestive tract can handle it. But let's think, do our cows need a certain amount of indigestible fiber, or in this case indigestible NDF, to keep the rumen honest and make the rumen microbes really function for us? And so that's kind of an interesting concept that probably no one has tackled yet, but they will in the future. I'm saying that if I have about a 60% NDF digestibility, which Pat Huffman tells me is the typical number, then I take 40% and I back calculate on my TMR, and you can see I come up with somewhere around 6 or 7 pounds of indigestible NDF. And I think, Steve, that's why we see some people adding straw to their high-producing lactating rations, is the rations are going through so quickly, the fiber is so less effective or functional that they put a pound or 2 of straw in to slow things down. And of course, we at Illinois are calculating lignin levels, and we think the total lignin from all feed sources should be that 3 to 4% range. Again, fine-tuning that ration to say, can we make that forage really work for us and balance it off correctly? So that takes care of our updating on forages, and we will move on to our next topic, and we're going to probably bang right through that. Again, if you have questions, webinar participants, and we have a number online, feel free to type those in, and we'll answer them here in about another half hour. Let's go to fine-tuning fermentable carbohydrates. Steve, this is a little bit of an update of what we did on January, but this is a new PowerPoint, and I think this is a take-home PowerPoint. It's Mary Beth Hall's PowerPoint, again from the USDA Forage Research Center, and you'll see 4 curves up there. Let's look at that purple curve down there. That's that Kansas State purple, I guess, and you can see that that's for Steve's benefit. That's NDF only. So we're looking at.
No, it's not Northwestern's purple. It's got to be Kansas State.
It's Northwestern purple. Okay. It's always good to have Steve online to keep us honest here. Anyway, NDF, we're looking at ruminant fermentable carbohydrates, and I think wherever this price of corn and forages go, these bacteria don't read the book. They don't see CNN every night. They don't read Steve's reports here, and so as a result, you can see as far as rate, and you can see that's expressed as microbial protein production. So obviously, the higher the number I have, that's more aggressive those microbes are, and then you can see time across the bottom. And look at these curves, folks. That northwestern purple is NDF only. You can see it's a lower, slower curve. The next purple one with the X's has added to that is going to be starch. You can see it has a much steeper curve to it. Notice it lags behind the other two curves. More about that in a second, but it peaks out at the very highest number. Then we come into the green curve. I guess that's Green Bay Packer gold green, and you can see that's pectin. There's your beet pulp. You can see it's a very fermentable fiber source. And then comes sugar. And we're going to say just a few words about sugar here in just a minute, but the point is, how do these curves function? How do they come together? And that's a little bit of the art, and we fine-tune rations of getting the right numbers. And we'll give you some Illinois numbers here in just a minute. So here we do a survey, and Steve asked, and I said, let's try that. Let's find out what level of starch do you folks online have in your ration. So here's your chance to vote. And so at this point, you will go in and vote at this point. And I guess at this point, Jim is telling me you should be able to click on one of those and send that to us. So at this point, we will ask you to vote. And so far, it's a bunch of Republicans. Nobody has voted yet. Steve, your idea is working well. But anyway, you can see this low 22% starch is a modestly low diet. Some of our producers don't know, and maybe that's another legitimate answer. So we'll let you go in and vote.
I'm not able to click on mine, Mike.
Pardon?
I'm not able to click on one of my options.
The poll is now open, Jim. Should be able to vote now?
Well, yes, they can, but since Steve is an organizer, he cannot vote. We don't try to slant.
Well, it would have been pretty complicated for me to vote because we have one milking group that is less than 22% starch at 21, and we have three milking groups at the Hoard Dairyman farm that are 22%. So I actually would have had to select two, to be honest with you. But anyway,
okay.
You can add that to the poll numbers.
Well, we don't want to bias it at this point. Now, how do we know if they're voting, Jim?
So we have 66%.
Oh, I'm seeing it, Mike. We have 4% less than 22, 33% 22 to 25, and 37% 25 to 28. 7% are greater than 28, and 19% indicates they're not sure.
Okay, well, we're going to...
oh, there it is.
We're going to close the poll now. Am I going to close that, or are you going to close that? Okay, so the very final official. Steve, do you see the official final?
Yes, I do now. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's repeat. This is it. The election is over. The Democrats can go back to Wisconsin now and Indiana. What are the numbers, Steve? Let's read it. Can our people see them? Yes. Oh, our people can see them. Well, you don't have to read them, Steve.
This slide should be up there. Go ahead, Mike.
Yep.
You can comment
so
on
it's really pretty interesting at this point. You can see that we have about 4% that are modestly low. Well, let's move on. What does this all mean? Well, basically, here's the numbers that I'm going to share with you in terms of I'm targeting for soluble fiber. I'd like to be around 10 or 12% of the ration dry matter. Starch, 24 to 26. So obviously, Steve, your Jerseys and Guernsey cows are just starving for starch out there. And sugar, 4 to 6%. Now remember, if you are low, Steve, you're herd on the low end at 22% starch. Then I'm assuming you may have some added sugar or some high quality forages or beet pulps in there to pick up the difference as far as that goes.
Wet brewers, and we're using some of the whey product that has quite a bit of sugar in it.
Ah, so he's got whey, so he has sugar. Well, let's go to sugar. Oh, let's look at this number first quickly. This is brand new. In fact, Pat Huffman will be speaking about this at our four-state meeting. This is a new term called relative grain quality, an RGQ. Now, if that looks like relative forage quality, ding, 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 you're exactly right. So what Pat Huffman and Randy Shaver have done is looked at such things as the particle size of the corn, moisture content if it's high moisture, and then a chemical analysis for starch analyses, in vitro starch digestibility in 7 hours, and then prolamine. Prolamine, of course, is the amino acid, or the protein, I should say, not amino acid, protein that locks up the starch that makes it less digestible. And so what they do is they go in and you run this test. This is data guidelines that are coming out of one of our Midwest labs looking at the rates in 7 hours. And I think, Steve, this is just classic. It simply shows that high moisture corn, especially at this time of the year as it's been stored, 88% of the starch can be fermented in the rumens. That means that is el smoko. It goes quickly, so it means you got to make sure the rumen is certainly buffered and stabilized. And then you can see what medium and low is. I go to the next column is corn silage. Some of the workers from Pioneer would suggest this time of the year that can approach 90% of the starch in corn silage can be fermented in the rumen, which may mean you have a little more DA or challenges than you would have had, say, back in October when it was still unfermented, or some Michigan State will call it uncooked, and you can see the number coming down. Here's your dry corn, and you can see again, depending on particle size, probably anything else, this number can be modestly low. So I think that's suddenly we have a fine-tuning tool that you can send in to labs, and they will give you the 7-hour in vitro digestibility test. So let's give you an example. This is a 175 RGQ number. That makes it modestly high, although I need to get more training from Pat. Here's your example. It was a 28% moisture corn. That's a pretty good moisture level, high moisture corn. It had 5% prolamine in it at this point, and which is a little higher starch number associated with the starch. It's about 69% starch, so it's not a really high starch number. We expect that to be 72 to 74 in Illinois. It's 2,000 microns. That's the mean particle size of the high moisture corn, so it's ground probably a little coarse, but not too bad. So that gives you the number. You can see the TDN. That's something you can put in your software program, either as TDN or net energy, and that's at 3 times maintenance. That's not 3x milking. That's 3 times the maintenance level of feed intake, and that's where most of our cow rashes are going to be at, if not even slightly higher. You can then see, as we move the micron size down, how this RFQ goes up. So trust me, if you had over 200, I would be nervous, even though it has a really nice energy value. That's got acidosis challenge written all over it. The cost for this analysis, one lab in the Midwest, $47. If you to get this whole report, if you do just the 7-hour analyses and starch, that's $24. So again, gives you a little idea, again, for fine-tuning starch numbers. Let's take a quick look at sugar then as we wrap up here. And this is a summary slide from a colleague of mine looking at data from the USDA Forage Center, from Ohio State, and from, I believe, from maybe Michigan, or it could be Utah. I'm not sure where OBA. That's probably Utah data. Anyway, you can see all three of these show higher dry matter intakes and more fat-corrected milk. I selected just one study just to drive home about 2 or 3 points. Here you can see this is the Broderick work, Glenn Broderick, a good colleague up at Wisconsin at the USDA Forage Research Center, looking at no added sucrose, that's a source of sugar, 2.5%, 5%, and 7.5%. Very busy slide, some of you are going to have to come back to this. You can see that generally speaking, with no added sugar, you're going to be around 2.5% to 3% sugar. That relates a little bit to how much hay you're feeding and other sources of feeds in your diet. You can see how it goes up to 5, 7, and 10. Now take a look as they did this. Notice the starch went from 28 down to 21. Steve, that may be your ration more on the right side of this chart than on the left side of the chart at this stage of the game. Now you can see, that's the first point, and I have about the same amount of sugar starch equivalent sitting in the ration. Notice it's almost 7.5%. The next PowerPoint, again, it has tons of numbers. That's going to be tough for all of you to digest, but let me look at a couple key factors in yellow. Dry matter was actually enhanced. That is statistically significant at the 2% level, which means 98% of the time you add sugar to the diet, we expect our cows to eat more diet. Notice the butterfat test went up and total pounds of protein went up, and of course right now fats are worth almost $2.50 a pound. Notice the protein didn't change much. Milk production went up. You can see this is 3.5 fat corrected milk. We went up from 90 to 93 to 96, and then do you see what happened? It went down. So this is what they call a quadratic effect, which means that once you get too much sugar, it's kind of like my eating M&Ms and salad. It makes a difference. I'll eat the M&Ms first. I may not eat the salad. Same thing with this cow with high levels of sugar. The bottom line, you can see, even though sugar is a little bit more expensive, but let me tell you, with the current high prices of corn, sugar is becoming more attractive. And of course, Steve, you've got a whey permeate product up there that's really attractive at that point. But you can see again the first three columns there. You can see a $7.70, $7.90, $8, and then a slight decrease. So that's the other take-home message.
We're running in the mid sixes on sugar in our ration at the present time.
A
6.6,
good comment.
6.7 in that area.
Okay, very good.
Now, was that last slide? Was that added sugar, that sucrose?
Let's back up here, and the answer is the total. The added was 5%. That if you were going to pick the pot, the dye to feed, it'd be 5%. On top of the background, 2.7.
Right,
so it was about 7% sugar. How much sugar do you have in your diet, Steve?
We're running 6.6, 6.7.
Is that total or added?
No, that's total.
That's total. So, Steve, you're somewhere between those the second and third column, or kind of you might say the middle of the chart. Now you can see that's critical on fine tuning the ration. The other one I'll put up again, this is part of the broader work, which I found fascinating for you nutritionists out there. Notice this is the effect on fiber digestibility, and you can see not only, and that's probably when we get more dry matter intake and more milk, then not only do we have a more rapid source of fermentable carbohydrate, we get more fiber digestion going on. So, an interesting study to take a look at. And so when you look at fine tuning with sugar, you realize if you look way back early, we have a quick carbohydrate source. We may improve fiber digestibility. We may reduce feed sorting. That's another important point when we look at precision feeding. And we may impact milk components, in some cases fat, in other cases milk protein as well. So certainly that is another factor as well. Another one is looking at levels of rumensin. We had this one on our earlier PowerPoint. We won't spend much time on it, but I think, remember, folks, 300 milligrams of rumensin is equivalent to about 1.5 pounds of corn. So if you're fine-tuning, you're saying, let me think about that for a second. 300 milligrams of rumensin is going to cost me 3 cents. About a penny per 100 milligrams is a typical number. And if corn is now at that high price Steve is talking about, that's well in excess of 20 cents. Should I put 3 cents in to get an additional 20 cents worth of starch equivalent? It looks like it's a pretty straightforward decision. More recently, however, we picked up this little PowerPoint, and it looks at higher levels. And we saw this. This is some Cargill research that was sponsored in early lactation cows. Now look at this one. There's the control, the 300 milligrams, which I think most of us in the Midwest and the U.S. are feeding at this stage of the game. See that nice milk increase? Look at 450, folks. Look at 450. A nice jump there at this stage of the game. Look what it does to dry matter intake. So in early lactation cows, rumensin appears to enhance dry matter intake. That is not a legal claim that Lanco will make, but it's some very interesting data. And just like the sugar, take a look at 600 guys and gals. We lost milk. We lost dry matter intake. So again, fine-tuning, where should you be? Should you be at 250, 300, 350, 400, 450? Yes, there are some people in Indiana at 500. Steve, do you know how much rumensin you are feeding out there at your farm with those Guernseys and Jerseys at this point? And Steve, I know you're muted. He's not answering, so either he's muted or he doesn't know. We won't pick on him anymore at this point.
It's percent of dry matter, Mike. It's
You're
listed
what?
on a percent of dry matter.
Percent of the dry matter.
It's listed on a percent of dry matter, so it's like 0.006, 0.005.
Oh boy, somebody better get out the calculator.
So I'm not sure how that translates into milligrams.
Just listening to your number, my guess is you're going to be around about 260 or 280, which may be right for Jerseys and Guernseys. Look at the butterfat there. You'll notice the butterfat test did take some hit with rumensin at this point. However, if you look at the fat to protein, which you do not have in front of you, that butterfat test is high in the control cows because their early lactation cows probably were showing what? Higher mobilization of body fat. So if you look at the protein test, that high butterfat test may be an artifact of fat mobilization more so than rumen synthesis and going from there. Very interesting story, though, when we talk today about fine-tuning where we should be. Well, we covered this one a bit earlier, and that is the fecal starch units at this stage of the game. And so, Steve, we're running short on time. We're just going to breeze through that. Again, if you're fine-tuning, if you run fecal starches, we spent more time on it on January. This is another tool that if you have fecal starches over 4 or 5%, you better be selling your manure on a starch equivalent base because you have starch in the manure. And Jim Ferguson, Dr. Jim Ferguson at the University of Pennsylvania Vet School indicates about 2/3 of a pound of milk per unit of starch over 5 or 6%. So obviously this is important, and it will cost you about $17 to $18 to get this done. One of our commercial labs in Wisconsin reports they had over 1,000 samples of feces for starch done in 2010. So again, one of those fine-tuning tools that we can think about as far as trying to find out, are we actually using that expensive starch effectively in my dairy cattle? Well, Steve, we're going to another topic here, and again, we got a couple of questions that came in. Type those in, but we're going to finish up our webinar here because I know some of you have to leave us at about 12:45, 12:50. Fine-tuning byproducts. We covered this in January, but let me tell you, prices have changed. And so the big change here, we have feed val at $7.40 a bushel. We were at $6.40 back in January. Limestone and tallow is at $44 a hundred or 44 cents a pound, and historically that's been around 30 cents, 34 cents, and that's because of biodiesel. We're now taking those oils and make them into diesel fuel because of some tax advantages that came on in the tax bill that came in late December. So we look at feed val. Here sits feed val from Wisconsin, and you'll see the break-even prices. Now soy hulls become a better buy. Back in January, they were not a good buy. With that higher fat value, and that's why some of you need to be thinking, if you're going to feed fat, what will my sources be? And now you can see fuzzy cottonseed sits up at $3.80 a ton. The price right now in central Illinois is about $300 a ton for fuzzy cottonseed. So even though cottonseed, as farmers are saying, gee, Hutchins, that's way too expensive, the answer is, well, relative to what? And I think that's the fine-tuning message for today, relative to what? My corn gluten feed, you can see a very good buy. Brewer's grain, a good buy. Unfortunately, you guys and gals aren't drinking enough Budweiser beer because it's not available right now. And there sits your distillers. It's gone up quite a bit in price from where it was back here just 3 months ago, but still a good buy at this stage of the game. Let's walk then over to, here's some byproduct feeds. Here sits meat and bone meal, blood meal, canola meal. At this point, you can see canola meal is getting very close to break even. A fish meal is never going to be a good buy. Here comes your heat-treated soy products. That could be your soy plus, soy best, soy pass. Those kind of products, those are your break-evens. Notice the rumen undegradable has a real impact. You can see it's worth $50 a ton if that soy product is properly treated to get the more rumen bypass. There's your heat-treated soybeans at 45, and again, they can be quite variable as well. And then we talk about fine-tuning. Two things. You say, well, Mike, you know, all that phosphorus in meat and bone meal, I can't use that. And so what I did is I put a zero value into phosphorus, and now you can see that phos is quite valuable meat and bone meal, but still way above break-even price at this stage of the game. And then you look at lysine over here, and again, if you are going to be buying lysine, your ration as you're fine-tuning, look at rumen undegraded or rumen or basically lysine at the small intestine. Suddenly you can see that my blood meal, even though it is not a cheap buy, it is still a very effective buy if you're looking for 10 grams of rumen intestinal available lysine at this stage of the game. Again, another take-home point on fine-tuning if you're looking at amino acids. Then we look at the sesame program, and again, this one is interesting, as you'll see a bit later here. And right now, this one does not use oil, does not use phosphorus, it uses energy. So interesting, remember on this one, energy from oil, from fat, from sugar, from starch is all the same. It doesn't differentiate where feed val does. Then it has the two sources of metabolizable protein and then the two sources of energy. And look at this one. Well, the first one's going to catch your eye because it sure got my eye, and that is says, you know what, you crooks, at $7.25 a bushel, and that was the price that we used, I should say Mark Tagler used for me, who has the sesame. It says you could continue to buy corn up to $10.40 a bushel relative to all the other energy sources in that 30 base unit. Kind of interesting point. So it says corn is underpriced. Now, don't be telling the pig guys and the corn growers that, or they're going to go nuts on you. But you can see here, soybean meal is a good price. Look at your corn silage, still a very good price, even at $60 a ton, and that's the number we're estimating. It still was worth $71 a ton. You can see distiller's grain gets hurt because of the oil. Look at soy hulls. Soy hulls really gets hammered, and you say, Hutchins, how did that happen? And that is because it has no effective NDF, and therefore gets penalized hugely because of its lack of effective NDF. And you can see hay breaks at about $224 a ton. So again, guys and gals, boys and girls, managers, owners, veterinarians, consultants, what are you going to be recommending to your producers or on your farms in 2011 as we see this a roller coaster ride with these feed prices? We're going to switch here to feed additives very quickly. This is a new kid on the block, but again, if you're fine-tuning, where does this fit in? This is Hoard's Dairyman survey data. Steve, thank you very much for sharing that with us. You can see this is what, based on their survey, and of course they're in the process now of summarizing 2011, but you can see this is the numbers of farmers in 2010, which additives that they were using. You can see Rumensin is surprisingly low. The Elanco people told me last week that's wrong, Mike. Our data says over 60%, which then implies that some of my producers don't know what their starch numbers are. Mycotoxin binders reflect our damaged corn from 2 years ago. So here we get to vote again. So we're going to turn on the polls, and Jim is going to. It's open. Poll is open. Here we go. You can only vote once. This is not Chicago politics. You vote once and only once. Pick which additive would you select. So the polls are now open to start voting. And Steve, I'm sorry you can't vote, but if you want to tell us your vote, if you're this is America, you're not supposed to tell anybody your vote, but if you wish, we know you're a Republican. So Steve, which one of those 5 are you going to pick?
I think you've convinced me that the ionophore is a pretty good deal, but while we're voting here, Mike, you mentioned that we kind of went over the starch and the manure thing pretty quickly, but in more detail in your January webinar, so folks that want to can go back and see that on the archives if they just go back to the Forage Dairyman website, forage.com, and they can dig into that a little bit more if they'd like.
Yep, very good.
No pun intended there.
Yep. Oh, dig in a little more. That's a bunch of crap, but we'll move on. That's supposed to be funny as well, but we'll leave it at that. Anyway, the voting is what percent have voted here? We've got what percent of our people voted? Do
we have 66%. We'll give them about 5-10 more seconds here. And
come on, you Republicans, let's get online here. You cannot be boycotting these votes all the time, or you Democrats. Let's get online here at this stage.
Maybe it's the weather. They don't want to get out and vote.
They don't want to get out and vote. Anyway, we are. Everybody can see the poll. Can they see it?
Not yet.
Okay, that's it. Let's show them the vote. We're running out of time here. We're down 10 minutes.
The organizers.
Closing the vote, and now everybody can see it, or do we have to have Steve read it to them?
No, they see it.
They can see it. So the winner is ionophore, followed by buffer, followed by yeast, followed by mycotoxin, and nobody voted for biotin. Nobody voted for biotin. Well, let's move on. This is my list. I maybe should have put Hutchins up there, but these are the 6 I would recommend if I was consulting on the Hoard's Dairyman farm. Now, Steve, we're going to put you on the spot here in just a minute to find out which ones at the Hoard's Dairyman farm are being utilized. So those are the 6, but now I'm going to rank them for you, and I'm going to rank them into a couple different categories. The first one is what I call rumen impact. Anytime, folks, we fine-tune, I have an additive that's going to impact the rumen and its effectiveness, it's got to come right to the top of my list. And so Rumensin is 1A, which is slightly ahead of yeast and yeast culture products, which is 1B, followed by sodium bicarb and S-carb. Now, that's going to make some of my people unhappy because you'll see I put the yeast product ahead of the bicarb, and that is not quite how it shook out in our survey here. Then I'm going to go with silage. Now, why did I do that? Because I could probably feed my way around bicarb by feeding less corn silage and more baled hay, using a little bit less starch in the diet, use a little bit less fat in the diet, be cautious with my sugar or whey product as far as that goes, I might be able to get around that. I can't get around Rumensin. Rumensin is an antibiotic that selects against gram-positive bacteria. So we are selecting in the rumen microbes that give me the best feed efficiency and best performance, and of course that is the label on Rumensin. Then if you want to play hardball, I would come Rumensin 1, Cyanoactins, which was not on your list because I only could have 5, 2, 3 would be organic trace minerals. One could argue they are not or an additive because they do have a nutritional role, but they'd be 3, followed by yeast culture 4, bicarb 5, and biotin 6. So I can see I too would vote biotin last at this stage of the game. Again, we got a couple more questions coming in, and we'll tap on those here in just a minute. Then I have another list called additives as needed. Jim put that on the side. That means I got to crank my neck sideways. So James, you're in trouble because I get a kink in my neck. But these are products that I would use if I need that on my farm. And we're running out of time, so maybe you're going to have to come back and look at these, or maybe we'll come back and visit these at another conference or webinar. But you can see I'm going to use anionic products. The one at the bottom is if I'm very high in potassium and I need to get my DCAD number down to 0, I'm going to bring it down there. Now, if you can get down to 0 without a DCAD or an anionic product, then hooray for you. Binders. Notice we had about 9 of you picked on binders. I'm saying the only time I'm going to feed a microtoxin binder or flow agent. Legally, I cannot call it a binder. FDA will probably send me a note on this. Hopefully they aren't listening to this, but we're looking at flow agents, and that says if I have evidence of mold, I would put it in. There's a number of my producers aren't going to mess with it anymore. They said, there's always a risk for mold coming from my wet byproduct feeds, from my silages, or other sources there. I'm just going to put that in to be sure it minimizes any negative effect it can have. Okay, fine-tuning milk components. This will go very quickly at this point. Here are prices of March. That's worth money, and that's why Steve Larson and Hoard's is. Oh, by the way, Steve, I didn't let you in on your additives. What additives are you guys using at Hoard's Dairyman?
Well, we're using quite a few. We're using S-carb. We're using protected choline. We're using biotin. Rumensin, so quite a few of the ones that I don't think that we have a cult yeast product in there at the present time, but we're using most of what you're talking about.
Well, that should get a few people on your doorstep in the next week or so once we heard that.
I imagine.
I can think of 5 companies that will be over on your doorstep. Well, Steve, sorry, I meant to get you in there a bit earlier. I get going pretty quickly here. What about these components? And this is March 2011. Butter fat, $2.45 a pound. Protein, $3.20. So protein is pretty valuable. And we hope to have a webinar later on this year on amino acid balancing, Steve. So we think that this one will not go away at this stage of the game. So certainly very, very valuable. And so I then go back to that great research journal called Hoard's Dairyman, and I say, well, what's normal? What's normal? And I use this slide quite a bit, Steve. So again, we want to recognize Hoard's efforts pulling this in together. This is DHIR data that's always printed in the August 10th issue based on the various breed association activities. And so if you've got Holstein cows and you're on a DHR test in the United States, I expect your butterfat test to be around 3.7, and your true protein, so those of you in foreign countries, remember U.S. is true protein, 3.02. That ratio is 82%. If you divide fat into protein, you divide protein into fat, that's 1.23. So again, if you're going to fine-tune rations, are you on the money? Are your cows giving you the components? And almost all the milk, except for a few southeastern markets, are priced on pounds of fat and pounds of protein. Are you getting your money's worth in terms of milk components when you're fine-tuning rations? Jeff Renault gave us this data here about 6 months ago, and then the question is not only that, what kind of variation do you expect to see? He followed some 1,500 dairy herds. I assume these are Minnesota herds off of DHI, and the butterfat variation was about 0.06 of a point. So how much does your bulk tank jump around out there? Look at the range. We had some herds jumping almost a 0.1 point, and if you're fine-tuning rations, you're not fine-tuning rations if you got that kind of variation going on. Look at your protein number, 0.04 of a point, and you can see a much smaller variation out there as well, but it still moves around as well. So maybe that's your take-home message from today's webinar, and go back and take a look at your last milk checks from March to see what kind of variation you have. Then come in July and see how much they're jumping around as well. Here are my numbers in terms of what I'm looking for rations. I'm not going to read those to you, but when you're fine-tuning, what are your goals? And these are Mike Hutchins and Illinois Extension goals. They're not your goals, but notice there's some range numbers there. So again, I'm sure Steve is feverishly comparing his ration, because obviously he's got the numbers in front of him. Good for you, Steve, to see, are you in my ranges as far as that goes, looking at crude, and those, be careful. The second one's expressed as a percent of crude protein. The third one, a percent of microbial protein or essential amino acids. You could use it either way at this point, and those are Chuck Schwab's guideline numbers that I had at a conference about 6 months ago. Here comes my carb numbers. You saw the bottom ones earlier. NDF, ADF, you saw the lignin one a bit earlier as well. Those are my carb numbers. And here comes my fats and oils, and a huge argument here on the last one, PUFAs. And the best I could get from 7 different sources at a conference on Friday, this might be the magic number, because most of my software programs are calculating. PUFAs are power. These are your 18.2s, 18.3s. And so you can see about less than 500 milligrams. So those of you folks feeding distillers grains, eyes wide open, because you got a boatload of these. You got a boatload of these up there. Those are our levels of total fat, added fats and oils. Free oils would be distiller or ground up soybeans or pelleted fuzzy cottonseed. It means the oil has been ruptured out of the seed coat. So again, more benchmarks for you to take a look at. Well, let's wrap up here. We're in good shape. It has to be a political thing. Well, anyway, we're back. Let's wrap up here. Feeding metrics. Here's what I did. And we're off. And again, I think Steve said he's hearing us as well. Let's look at these numbers. We covered these also on in January, but let's update these very quickly. Here are some prices that I used here, and I don't think we got the latest PowerPoint which showed us the new corn silage and alfalfa numbers, so I will just have to shoot those from the hip as far as that goes. Here are your benchmark for 2011. This is very similar to what we had in January. And if we come up here, these are some what I call another metric, another fine-tuning feed cost per pound of dry matter. If I use the $7.40 bushel corn, and I use corn silage at $60 a ton, and hay at $190 a ton, that feed cost ends up being 12.5 cents. So basically, you can see in the last 3 months, since January to the April conference call, my feed costs went up basically about a penny to penny and a half per pound of dry matter. That means I'm going to add, since this is 50 pounds of dry matter, I'm adding 50 cents to my feed costs. So you can see for my 80-pound cow, that's going to be around $7.40 for that investment there. And income over feed costs, golly, you know, that one's all over the map right now. Steve said he's getting $26 for his milk, so obviously he's got color breeds. I'm guessing his cost is going to be close to 13 or 14 cents. Steve, do you have that number by any chance?
Well, actually, we're using 11 cents still.
Still at 11 cents.
That's some stuff we've locked in. You know.
Very good. So now there's a take-home message. They've got locked in some feed prices here, which is hooray for them, hooray for them, hooray for them. Notice, regardless what I do with the feed costs, my feed efficiency didn't change, because feed efficiency has nothing to do with the price of feed. It looks at milk yield and dry matter consumed by the cow corrected to 3.5 base. So that number does not change at all either as far as that goes. And so you can see this feed efficiency using the old feed price. That is about 67 cents for 0.2 of a point improvement in feed efficiency. Or you can see that's about 34 cents for 0.1 of a point. And when our feed prices go up, guess what this number does? It even gets bigger. It even gets bigger. So feed efficiency is huge. This is some Illinois data. We saw that in January. We're going to skip that. And we can now welcome questions, and we've got several questions here. You're welcome to type them in. You're welcome to leave us right now. My apologies for the 1 minute voice glitch at this point. Before you leave us, so we want to thank you very much to announce that on May 9th, Dr. Rick Grant has agreed to come in and discuss with us the impact of behavior on cow feeding, and that's going to be such things as bunk space, overcrowding, cow behavior patterns between first calf, second calf, pen moves, those kinds of things. There's a great presentation. And then we're pleased to have Dr. Lance Baumgart committed for June 13th, right on the money, heat stress feeding strategies. I know we had a question on that. Be sure you're online on June 13th to hear Dr. Lance Baumgart from Iowa State University. Some of you will recognize that name. He used to be at Arizona and just recently moved to Iowa State at this point. So we're going to go ahead and answer your questions again, and I want to again thank Elanco and Steve Larson, Hoard's Dairyman, for their continuous support, allowing us to produce these once a month on the second Monday of the month as far as that goes. Steve, before we answer any questions, any additional comments?
Well, Mike, I want to thank you for another wonderful presentation. Thank all of our participants for being with us today. And also we want to thank Elanco, of course, for their sponsorship of this webinar. And now is a good time to take some questions then.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and take, I think we've got 5 or 6 of them here. We'll take those, and again, we'll get through them very quickly. And if you have some concerns, then send them to Hoard's Dairyman, and Steve can, or Patty can pipe them down to us if you want a little more detail. So let's go through these pretty quickly. The first one I'll read because they can't see them, can they, Jim? Nope. First question says, what would it be the same effectiveness of fiber if I had 65% of fiber? And obviously he's from a foreign country because they spend fiber, unlike a Wisconsin farm boy would, in the second layer and none on the top screen compared to the 10%. My feeling is I need about 8 to 10% to set up the forage mat. So I would argue I would not do that. So if I had 0 on the top screen and 65 in the second screen, I'd be nervous. Now that top screen should be nothing longer than 1.5 to 2 inches, because Lou Armentano at Wisconsin would argue they will sort that stuff. So if they sort it, it doesn't do any good. But I would like to have, Judd Heinrich will have that number down to 4%, but if I had somewhere to be more inclusive of Penn State, 4 to 10 to 12% on the top screen. My guideline is if it's over 15%, it's too much. It will allow for some sorting to go on and or slower dry matter intakes. I have no data to back that up. Next question from Susan. Is there a preferred additive for heat stress? The 3 big ones, and Lance will give you a Bible and verse on that. Rumensin is a no-brainer because of its glucose synthesis and propionic acid production levels. Niacin, the rumen-protected niacin, is a no-brainer. Arizona work simply showing it causes more radiation of heat or blood flow to the exterior of the animal at that stage of the game. Bicarb in yeast cultures would fall into the category because they would stabilize the rumen pH. Early research says from NRC that the rumen pH runs about 0.2 of a point lower under heat stress. So if the rumen of your cow, your herd, was 6, it would, under heat stress it could be 5.8 before we do anything on feed intake or feed additives or any other ramifications because of the loss of some of the buffering capacity of the blood, and also because of blood flow to the external trying to cool these cows off. Moving on to the next one. Again, if you don't like my answer, type in and you can argue with me. Next one, you mentioned a ration should contain 3 to 4% lignin. Are the source of lignin important? Straw versus high quality forage to get that higher lignin level for rumen? Oh boy, what a great question. Probably. I got my neck on the line here along with a few other consultants of either using lignin as a criteria, but I think it would make a difference. We know straw stays in the rumen for about 3 days. High quality forages will so that fiber in high quality forage will exit less than 24 hours. Pasture, which has some lignin in, leaves in 12 hours. So yeah, you're right. It will make a difference there, and at some point, and we thought, and maybe you can remember that question, ask Rick Grant that question next month. He looked at fragility, how fragile the stem was, and the results were less than stellar. Interesting data, but we thought he was going to hit a home run there, and it looked like it might be a single as far as that goes. Next question, quickly. For inoculants, do treating alfalfa, haylage, corn silage, and high moisture corn, should you treat and Brett, the answer is you betcha. You betcha. And the rank order is high moisture corn is the most critical because of its lower dry matter content and risk of yeast and mold, followed by small grain forages. The next high risk one, that'd be like wheatlage or oatlage, followed by alfalfa is my third one because it's low in starch content, and corn silage would probably be the least one, that would be the lowest priority on inoculation, but the research is so powerful on it, so it simply says, as far as I'm concerned, Brett, all those wet feeds get treated at this stage of the game. Question on use and impact of DFMs to improve rumen efficiencies or reduce the chance of acidosis. With the high price ingredients, where do you think price per head limit could be? Boy, Dan, what a neat question. I think the DFMs are there. There are several good ones on the market right now. You ask them for their research. I think you're in that dime range. You're probably going to be okay, but I shouldn't have said that. But you ask a price, and I'm saying once you're over a dime, study the research carefully, because now it gets pretty pricey. I need a half a pound of milk to get my dime back as far as that goes. So I think we're going to see a lot more on that in the future on the DFMs. And so I have a couple of them that I think have research to back them, and at this point I'd get myself in trouble if I start mentioning brand names. So Dan, if you really want more, send me an email. We can answer it that direction. One of our international people say, what do you think about using glycerol and TMR? Maximum level 10%. 10% of the ration dry matter. That is data that comes from Purdue. And the gentleman's, I can see him right now, Dr. Dawkins had done that work, about 10% glycerol, and again, a pretty fast source. That's like propylene glycol, that's a glycerol also, so it's a pretty fast, so it could be a sugar source, and you can see again that fits pretty nicely with the sugar guideline as well. So 10% would be the max at this point, and some of that has to do with the contaminants that is with the glycerol, so just so you're aware of that as well. Next question. Mark says, do you need to include corn earlage in your presentation? Mark, that's a good point. Appreciate you. I recognize you from Southern Illinois. You're right. We're a big fan of earlage, but I'm going to call earlage snaplage. Earlage sometimes refers to just the ear, which would be the cob and the kernel. Snaplage includes the whole cob, the husk, and maybe some other plant parts. And Steve, maybe we need to put that on our wish list maybe at another webinar. Maybe we'll cover that. We're going to maybe cover corn silage in July, and maybe we'll do a kind of a corn silage, high moisture corn.
Good idea.
At that point. So we'll kind of put that down on our wish list, Mark. That's a good point. There's some wonderful numbers on earlage. It's going to come just because these big kernel processors we have out there, those big John Deere, New Hollands, and Clauses, can take 10 rows at a time, process it, and put it in structure, all pre-processed, ready to feed. So I don't have to roll it coming out. I don't have to grind it next to the pit or the bunker or stuff like that. It's going to come. What about urea, slow release urea? Yes. I think it has a potential place there. My concern is look at your price. The price gets very close to some of the vegetable protein sources, so think about price on this one at this stage of the game. For those listeners, and maybe Dr. Schwab will talk about that if we get him lined up later on this fall, that the urea goes at a slower rate. By and large, my hesitation is cost comparisons. And several companies have good research and products. Instead of it all being released in the first hour, it will dissipate over 8 or 10 hours. And so, yep, I hear you. Look at price. Look at price. The research is solid. It does go slower. It's all economics. Jack raises, for each unit change from a pound of grain to a pound of forage, what do you estimate the reduction in milk production would be? Jack, great question. Great question. Now, if we swap it out and don't fine-tune the ration, my forages are going to be around a 0.6 to 0.7 mcals. My TMR is going to be a 0.7778. My corn's going to be 0.9. So if you look at energy, 2/10 of a point per pound, 2/10 of a point of mcal is going to be about a half or 6/10 of a pound of milk. So, Jack, the answer is flying by the seat of my pants with those assumptions and those numbers. You know what they say, Jack, figures never lie, but liars always figure. I'd say at least a half a pound of milk, if not 2/3 of a pound of milk. However, Jack, we must never do that. So if you're going to bring more forage in, that forage has to be able to carry the ration and meet the microbial and cow requirements by fine-tuning. And Steve, that's the name of our topic. 2 more quick questions, and I know some of you have to leave. It's getting late here. Do you have any experience with glycerol toxicosis? I do not. I do not. So, again, that's an easy one to answer. And I think it has to do with the alcohol that's associated with the glycerol in the process. But Sean Dawkins and Jim Drakely could probably answer that a lot better than I can at this point. If somebody wants to type in a very quick response to help me out, that would be appreciated. Or Huberto, maybe you want to do that as well. And what are the sources of added sugars used at Hoard's farms? Pat asked that. Steve, you want to answer that?
Well, we're using the whey product, which I believe has quite a lot of sugar. I don't have the analysis in front of me, but even though it's marketed as a delactosed whey, it does have quite a lot of sugar in it. So I believe that would be our main source.
Yeah, so it's a lactose source at this point. I heard at a conference 2 weeks ago, and Steve, I'll get in trouble for doing it, but somewhere's around 4 to 6 cents per pound of dry matter. And so obviously Hoard's has to report this as a sin every day because they are stealing that. They are stealing that. But that's an extremely good price, very limited in supply. So trust me, don't everybody go to call Steve and say, where can I buy that? Because that's on a limited supply, probably tied to your shipper, is it not, where you're shipping your milk?
Well, actually, it's a different source, but
oops. Okay, right to Steve. Steve can broker this for you. Steve, get a little markup there. Kind of make a little money, for the old webinar at this stage of the game. At this point, another quick question came in, and we'll answer them as long as we got people online, and we still have 37 of you crooks. You must be cold or wintry out there. Another quick question because they're coming in now, and we'll welcome a few more, but we will cut this off here in about 3 more minutes. Give for better, for worse, or rich, for poor. Another question: is it a good idea to use slow-release urea to deal with heat stress? The answer is yeah, probably yes. There is some data that was done by Utah and by Arizona showing that high levels of rumen-degradable / soluble proteins did have some negative effects under heat stress. So, yep, you win. That's a good point. So, whoever typed that in, kudos for you. I would say the answer is yes. It might be advantageous if you're going to use urea as a source under heat stress, and you can ask Lance that in June as well. It looked like there may be an advantage to that. Do you prefer dead or live yeast? The research from California would suggest that the 4 major resources, of which some do not guarantee live yeast, have good biological responses on cows. And some of you could probably think very quickly the name of those 2 products in the marketplace, but their research says good cow response. And so some companies argue live yeast are important. Others will say it's the neutralites. In other words, the byproducts, or the products that come from the live yeast that are essential for stimulating the rumen microbes and performance in the cow. And so I've looked at data, or I should say Dr. Robinson has summarized data from the Journal of Dairy Science and published research, so I dot my I's across my T's on this one, because this is one that will probably get letters to Hoard's Dairyman, that when he looked at the Journal Research results, he looked at 4 different products. All 4 of them performed quite nicely. One had a little advantage over the other, but the difference was very, very small. And so I have no preference. My answer would be cost and service I get from the company. Boy, that could be a real wild one as well. And boy, and here comes my last question. It says, any experience with products like Nupro? And help me, I don't know. Jim Baltz, my colleague here, rolls his eyes. Steve, do you know what a Nupro is?
No, I can't help you, Mike.
No. So again, if you want to, send us an email on Nupro, and we will, if you can tell me what it is. If it's a DFM, if it is a feed ingredient, if it's based from soya, whatever the case is. Well, Steve, I'll turn the program back to you. We exceeded our time limit, but we had lots of great questions here. We thank you again, Steve. I'll let you wrap her up.
We still have a few people that have stayed with us for the questions, and we appreciate that. We thank you for your participation. Again, Mike, thanks to you for a great job, very interesting and timely topic, and we thank Elanco for bringing the webinar to us all today. So until next time, that's it.